September 12, 1942. 8:07 p.m. 250 miles southeast of Liberia, West Africa. Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartenstein pressed his face against the cold rubber eyepiece of U-156's attack periscope, watching the massive silhouette cut through the moonlit Atlantic. The target was enormous, over 19,000 tons by his calculation, running without escort, zigzagging poorly, completely vulnerable. Range? He asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the electric hum of the submerged submarine. 4,000 meters, Herr Kalu, his torpedo officer replied. Target bearing 035, speed 15 knots. Perfect. After 6 weeks of hunting in the South Atlantic with nothing but empty ocean and the occasional neutral Portuguese freighter, U-156 had finally found prey worth the expenditure of a torpedo. A big one. The kind of kill that earned mentions in BDU, Befehlshaber der U-Boot, U-Boat Command daily reports, and maybe, if the gods smiled, a Knight's Cross. Hartenstein was 34 years old, a career naval officer who had commanded U-156 since March 1941. In 18 months of combat, he had sunk 14 Allied ships totaling 97,504 tons. Competent, professional, but not spectacular. Not yet an ace like Prien or Kretschmer, whose names were celebrated across Germany. Just another U-boat commander doing his duty in the endless war of attrition against Allied shipping. Tonight would change that. The target was clearly a troopship. Its size, speed, and route all confirmed it. British, certainly. Probably carrying reinforcements from Britain to Egypt via the Cape of Good Hope, the long route around Africa that the Allies had been forced to use since the Mediterranean became a shooting gallery. Thousands of tons of ship. Hundreds, maybe thousands of soldiers. One torpedo could remove an entire battalion from Churchill's order of battle. Tube 1 ready, the torpedo officer reported. Tube 2 ready. Hartenstein calculated the geometry in his head. The target was zigzagging, changing course every 7 minutes, but the pattern was predictable. Amateur stuff. Merchant marine captains playing at naval tactics, following a schedule rather than genuine evasion. He could practically set his watch by the turns. Stand by Tube 1, Hartenstein ordered. The control room fell silent. 48 men holding their breath in a steel cylinder 77 meters long and 6.6 meters wide. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and electrical equipment. They'd been submerged for 4 hours, tracking this target, and the atmosphere was beginning to get stale. But nobody complained. This was what they lived for, the moment of the kill. Through the periscope, Hartenstein watched the target complete another turn, steadying onto a new course. He counted the seconds. 30, 40, 50. Long enough. The ship's captain thought he was being clever, unpredictable. He wasn't. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as compressed air launched the torpedo from its tube. 21 feet of steel and explosives, carrying 280 kilograms of Sheeswall 36, equivalent to 300 kilograms of TNT, accelerating to 30 knots. The torpedo's electric motor left no telltale bubble track, no warning for the target. Just death approaching silently through black water. Torpedo running true, the sonar operator reported. Time to impact, 90 seconds. Hartenstein kept his eye pressed to the periscope, watching. This was always the worst part, the waiting. 90 seconds felt like 90 hours. The torpedo could malfunction, run deep, run shallow, circle back. German torpedo technology had been plagued with problems early in the war. Magnetic detonators that exploded too early or not at all. Depth-keeping mechanisms that failed. Impact fuses that crumpled without triggering. But by September 1942, most of those problems had been solved. U-156 torpedoes were reliable. Deadly. 60 seconds. The target continued on its course, unaware. Hartenstein could see details now, the ship's superstructure, the single funnel, the derricks and cargo handling equipment. Definitely a passenger liner converted to military transport. The British had dozens of them, requisitioned from civilian service and painted grey for war duty. Floating coffins for the men crammed into their holds. 30 seconds. Hartenstein's hands gripped the periscope handles. His crew waited in absolute silence. The only sounds were the electric motors humming, the faint ping of the sonar, and 48 men breathing in controlled, measured breaths. 10 seconds. Time seemed to freeze. The torpedo was invisible beneath the surface, racing toward its target at 30 knots. The ship sailed on, its crew probably drinking tea, playing cards, sleeping in their bunks. Soldiers below decks, dreaming of home, maybe writing letters they'd mail from Cape Town or Freetown or wherever the convoy was headed. None of them knew they had 10 seconds to live. 5, 4, 3. Boom. The explosion was visible even at 4,000 meters. A massive column of white water erupted from the ship's starboard side, just aft of the bridge. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the stern visibly, the entire aft section of the ship rising several meters before crashing back down. Secondary explosions followed, probably the ship's boilers rupturing, adding superheated steam to the carnage. Hit! The sonar operator shouted, unable to contain his excitement. Detonation confirmed. Breaking up noises. The control room erupted in controlled celebration. Men shook hands, slapped shoulders. The torpedo officer was grinning like a madman. Even the usually stoic chief engineer allowed himself a smile. But Hartenstein kept watching through the periscope. Something was wrong. The ship was listing heavily to starboard, settling rapidly by the stern. That was expected. They'd been hit below the waterline, probably flooded the engine room and aft compartments. But the ship was going down fast. Too fast. A vessel that size, even with catastrophic damage, should have taken 30 minutes to sink, maybe an hour. This one would be gone in 10. More concerning was what he could see in the water. Debris. Lifeboats. And something else. Something that made his stomach clench. Bring her to periscope depth, Hartenstein ordered. Stand by to surface. The submarine rose smoothly through the dark water. At 15 meters, Hartenstein extended the periscope fully, sweeping the area around the stricken ship. The target was listing at least 30 degrees now, its stern already underwater. Lifeboats were being launched, some successfully, others capsizing as panicked passengers overloaded them. And then he saw them. Women. In the water. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Their white dresses and nurses' uniforms were clearly visible in the moonlight, floating in the oil-slicked water like pale flowers scattered across a dark pond. Mein Gott, Hartenstein whispered. Women. On a military transport. That was impossible. The British didn't put women on troopships crossing submarine-infested waters. Military transports carried soldiers, equipment, maybe some military nurses in the medical sections, but not civilians. Not women in white dresses. Unless. Surface the boat, Hartenstein ordered, his voice tight. All ahead 1/3. Steer for the target. The diving officer looked confused. Herr Kalu? We're surfacing? In the target area. You heard me. Surface. Now. Protocol said they should dive deep and run silent, putting distance between themselves and the kill before Allied escorts arrived. But there were no escorts. No destroyers racing toward them with depth charges. Just a dying ship and hundreds of people in the water. U-156 broke the surface with a rush of compressed air and cascading water. Hartenstein was up the ladder and onto the bridge before the water had finished draining from the deck. He raised his binoculars, focusing on the sinking ship. The name was visible on the stern, illuminated by emergency lighting, Laconia. Hartenstein knew that name. Every U-boat commander knew the major British liners. The Laconia was a Cunard White Star passenger ship, 19,695 tons, built in 1922. Fast, luxurious, one of the premier transatlantic liners before the war. Converted to armed merchant cruiser status in 1939, then to troopship duty in 1941. But why were there women in the water? Bring us closer, Hartenstein ordered. Slow speed. Watch for survivors. As U-156 crept toward the sinking ship, the full horror of what he'd done began revealing itself. The water was filled with people. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. They were clinging to debris, thrashing in the oil-covered water, screaming in languages Hartenstein didn't immediately recognize. And so many of them were women. His first officer, Mansman, appeared on the bridge. Herr Kalu, what are our orders? Get some men on deck with lines and life vests. We're picking up survivors. Mannesman stared at him. Sir? We're rescuing them. You heard me. Move. As U-156 approached the first group of survivors, Hartenstein heard something that made his blood turn to ice water. They were speaking Italian. Aiuto. Per favor, aiuto. Salvatesi. Dio mio, salvatesi. Italian. Not English. Italian. Germany's allies were drowning in the South Atlantic, torpedoed by a German submarine. September 12, 1942. 8:47 p.m. South Atlantic. Hartenstein stood frozen on U-156 bridge, binoculars pressed against his face, watching hundreds of people thrash in the oil-slicked water. The voices carried clearly across the distance desperate Italian, broken English, screaming in languages he couldn't identify. And beneath it all, the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life, women crying for help. Herr Kalu, Mansman said quietly beside him. Those are Italians down there. Our allies. I can hear them. Sir, what were Italians doing on a British troopship? That was the question that was tearing through Hartenstein's mind like shrapnel. Italian soldiers didn't sail on British vessels. The Italians had their own navy, their own transport ships. Unless prisoners, Hartenstein said, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. They are prisoners of war. The British must be transporting Italian POWs. The implications crashed down on him one after another. He had just torpedoed a ship carrying Italian prisoners, soldiers who had fought alongside Germany in North Africa, now being transported to POW camps in Britain or South Africa or India. Men who should have been protected by the Geneva Convention, who should have been sailing under some kind of Red Cross protection or at minimum with notification to Axis forces. But the British hadn't notified anyone. They'd packed Italian POWs onto a converted liner, mixed them with their own troops, and sent the ship through submarine-infested waters without any kind of warning or protection. And now they were drowning. Get ropes over the side, Hartenstein ordered. Start pulling people up. Italians first, but anyone who can reach us. Move. The crew of U-156 scrambled into action with German efficiency. Within minutes, sailors were stationed along the deck with lines, life vests, and anything that could help pull survivors from the water. The submarine's small rubber dinghy was inflated and launched, piloted by two volunteers who began paddling toward the nearest group of survivors. The first man they pulled aboard was an Italian soldier, maybe 25 years old, coughing up seawater and oil. He was wearing the tattered remains of an Italian army uniform, soaked through and covered in fuel oil. When he realized he was on a German submarine, he began crying not from fear, but from relief. Tedeschi, he gasped. Grazie a Dio. More Italians came aboard. Then British soldiers, their hands raised in surrender until they realized the Germans were there to help, not capture. Then women. The nurses. Hartenstein watched as his crew pulled a woman in her 30s from the water. She was wearing what had once been a white nurse's uniform, now black with oil. She was semi-conscious, hypothermic, barely breathing. Two German sailors carried her carefully below decks, where the submarine's medic was already treating the first wave of survivors. How many can we take? Hartenstein asked his chief engineer, Oberleutnant Zersi Polchow. Polchow did rapid calculations in his head. The boat is designed for 55 crew, sir. We're already at 53. We have maybe space for 30 more if we pack them tight. 40 if some stay on deck. Hartenstein looked at the water. There were hundreds of people out there. Maybe 1,000. Maybe more. The Laconia was completely on its side now, the hull visible above the waterline, people still clinging to the railings and sliding off into the ocean as the ship rolled further. 30 survivors. Maybe 40. Against 1,000 drowning. The mathematics of horror. Do what you can, Hartenstein said. Get as many Italians aboard as possible. The rest, find debris, make rafts, anything to keep them afloat. As his crew worked frantically, Hartenstein descended to the radio room. What he was about to do violated every principle of submarine warfare. It would reveal his position to any Allied ship or aircraft within hundreds of miles. It could get his boat sunk, his crew killed. Admiral Donitz would probably court-martial him. But there were 1,000 people drowning, and he was the one who had put them there. Radio operator, Hartenstein said. Send this message in clear English. No code. I want every ship in the Atlantic to hear it. The radio operator, Oberfunkmat Schnee, stared at him. Sir? Clear English? That's... I know what it is. Send it. Schnee's hands trembled slightly as he prepared to transmit. In clear. Unencoded. Broadcasting their exact position to anyone listening. It was suicide. Hartenstein dictated. If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack provided I am not being attacked by ship or air force. I picked up 193 men. 4 to 53 south, 11 to 26 west. German submarine. Schnee finished transcribing, then looked up. Sir, you're certain? Send it. Repeat every 30 minutes until I tell you to stop. The message went out at 9:15 p.m., crackling across hundreds of miles of ocean in plain English. Any British ship, American ship, South African ship within range would hear it. They would know exactly where U-156 was. They would know a German submarine was on the surface, vulnerable, practically inviting attack. Hartenstein returned to the bridge. The scene around him had transformed from combat operation to desperate rescue. His crew, trained killers who had spent 2 years sinking Allied ships without mercy, were now throwing themselves into the water to save drowning enemies. Sailors were forming human chains, passing survivors hand-to-hand from the ocean to the submarine's deck. The rubber dinghy was making continuous trips, each time returning with 4 or 5 more people. And still, the Laconia was dying. The ship was nearly on its side now, the port hull completely out of the water, the starboard side submerged. People were sliding off in streams, some jumping voluntarily, others simply losing their grip and falling. Lifeboats that had been successfully launched were overloaded, sinking under the weight of too many desperate passengers. Others had capsized, spilling their occupants back into the oil-covered water. Herr Kalu, a lookout shouted. Lifeboats approaching from starboard. Hartenstein swung his binoculars. 3 lifeboats were rowing toward U-156, packed with survivors. As they drew closer, he could see they were mostly Italian soldiers, with a handful of British guards and what looked like Polish uniforms mixed in. The first lifeboat pulled alongside. The men inside looked up at the submarine with expressions ranging from hope to terror to complete exhaustion. One of them, an Italian officer with captain's insignia on his tattered uniform, called up in broken German. Bitte, we have wounded. Women and children. Please. Children. The word hit Hartenstein like a torpedo. There are children on that ship. Sigh, yes. British families. Civilians. Women and children going to South Africa. The ship had everyone. Soldiers, prisoners, civilians, all together. Hartenstein felt the world tilt. This wasn't a military transport. It was an evacuee ship. The British had mixed everything together: their own troops, Italian POWs, civilian refugees, families, women, children, all on one vessel, and sent it through submarine-infested waters. Get them aboard, Hartenstein said, his voice hollow. All of them. By 10:30 p.m., U-156 had picked up 193 survivors. The submarine designed for 55 men now carried 246 souls. They were packed into every available space: the control room, the torpedo rooms, the engine room, the crew quarters, the deck. Some were sitting on the torpedoes themselves. Others huddled in the narrow passageways. The submarine had become a refugee boat, wallowing low in the water under the weight of humanity. And still, hundreds more were in the ocean. Hartenstein watched the Laconia's final moments through his binoculars. The ship was completely on its side now, the bridge underwater, the hull gleaming in the moonlight. The emergency lights were still burning, giving the wreck an eerie glow. People still clung to the railings, to the propeller shaft, to anything they could hold. The ship was settling by the bow now, the stern rising slowly as the forward compartments flooded. At 11:23 p.m., the Laconia began its final plunge. The bow went first, sliding beneath the surface with terrible grace. The stern rose higher, higher, until the ship was nearly vertical, pointing at the stars like an accusing finger. The emergency lights flickered once, twice, then went out, plunging the wreck into darkness. And then, with a sound like 1,000 tons of metal screaming, the Laconia slid beneath the Atlantic. The suction pulled dozens of swimmers down with it. Hartenstein watched helplessly as people who had survived the torpedo, survived 90 minutes in the water, were dragged under by the dying ship's final grasp. The ocean churned and boiled above the wreck, then slowly calmed. And then the screaming started again. The survivors who had been pulled under began surfacing, gasping, coughing, calling for help. But many didn't surface at all. Hartenstein checked his watch. 11:23 p.m. 3 hours and 16 minutes from torpedo impact to final sinking. The Laconia was gone. And somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people were now in the water, scattered across several square miles of South Atlantic, with night falling and sharks already circling. One submarine could hold maybe 250 people, and he already had that many. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. He could save hundreds. But thousands were going to die. "Sir," Mansman said quietly, "we're receiving responses to your broadcast." Hartenstein descended to the radio room. Schnee handed him a piece of paper with several decoded messages. From Vichy French sloop Annamite. Position 450 miles north. Preceding your location. Eta 36 hours. From Vichy French cruiser Gloire. Position 600 miles. Proceeding. Eta 48 hours. From U-506, Kapitänleutnant Werner. Position 200 miles south. Preceding your location. Eta 18 hours. From U-507, Korvettenkapitän Schacht. Position 150 miles west. Preceding your location. Eta 12 hours. And one more message, this one from BDU, U-Boat Command in Lorient, France. From Admiral Karl Donitz himself. U-156, continue rescue operations. U-506 and U-507 ordered to assist. Vichy French ships notified. Maintain radio contact. Good luck. Donitz. Hartenstein read the message 3 times. Donitz was authorizing this. The head of the entire U-boat force was ordering submarines to abandon their patrols, reveal their positions, and conduct rescue operations for enemy survivors. It was unprecedented. Unthinkable. And it was happening. Send acknowledgement, Hartenstein ordered. Tell them we have 193 survivors aboard and estimate 1,500 to 2,000 still in the water. Request all assistance possible. As the night wore on, U-156 became a bizarre floating refugee camp. In the control room, Italian soldiers sat next to British guards who had been trying to kill each other hours earlier. In the forward torpedo room, German sailors shared their rations with Polish prisoners. On the deck, British nurses tended to wounded of all nationalities, using the submarine's limited medical supplies. One of the nurses, a British woman named Doris Hawkins, approached Hartenstein on the bridge. She was maybe 30 years old, her uniform destroyed, her face streaked with oil, but her eyes were clear and professional. "Captain," she said in accented German, "we have 3 critically wounded men below. They need surgery, proper medical facilities. How long until rescue ships arrive?" "At least 12 hours, Hartenstein replied. "Possibly more." She nodded, showing no emotion. Then 2 of them will probably die. We don't have the equipment. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, Captain. You saved my life. You saved all our lives. She paused. Why? We're your enemies. Hartenstein looked at her, then at the survivors packed onto his submarine, then at the hundreds still in the water, clinging to debris and lifeboats. He thought about his orders, his duty, his oath to sink Allied shipping without mercy. He thought about the young Italian soldiers crying with relief when they realized Germans were pulling them from the water. He thought about the children that had been on that ship. Because, he said finally, I am a naval officer, not a murderer. There are rules, even in war. The British forgot them when they packed civilians and prisoners onto a military transport. I will not forget them by leaving you to drown. Doris Hawkins studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. Thank you, Captain. She turned to go, then stopped. For what it's worth, you're a better man than the ones who put us on that ship. As she disappeared below, Hartenstein stood alone on the bridge, watching the dark water. Somewhere out there, U-506 and U-507 were racing toward them. Vichy French ships were steaming south. Help was coming. But it was going to be a very long night. And when the sun rose, the real test would begin. Because somewhere above them, Allied patrol aircraft were taking off from Ascension Island. And they were going to see a German submarine on the surface, packed with survivors, flying Red Cross flags. And they were going to have to make a choice. September 13, 1942. 6:47 a.m. South Atlantic. Dawn broke over a scene that defied every expectation of naval warfare. U-156 wallowed on the surface, sitting low in the water under the weight of 246 survivors packed into every available space. Around the submarine, scattered across several square miles of ocean, hundreds more survivors clung to lifeboats, rafts, and debris. And approaching from the south, the silhouette of U-506 was visible on the horizon. Hartenstein had not slept. For 10 hours, he'd stood on the bridge, coordinating rescue operations, directing lifeboats to clusters of survivors, broadcasting position updates in clear English every 30 minutes. His crew was exhausted. Many had been in the water themselves, swimming to reach survivors who couldn't make it to the submarine. They'd formed human chains, diving repeatedly to pull people from beneath debris. Several had nearly drowned when undertows pulled them under. The count was staggering. U-156 had 193 survivors aboard and another 204 large lifeboats tied to the submarine. U-506, now less than a mile away, was reporting similar numbers. They'd been picking up survivors since midnight, following Hartenstein's broadcast. And U-507 was due within the hour. But the losses were catastrophic. As sunlight spread across the ocean, the true horror became visible. Bodies. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Floating face down in the oil-slicked water, wearing life jackets that had kept them afloat even after death. Women in white dresses. Italian soldiers in torn uniforms. British troops. Polish guards. Civilians. And children. Hartenstein had ordered his crew not to count the dead. There was nothing they could do for them, and the psychological toll was already crushing his men. Several sailors had broken down weeping. Others had become grimly silent, their faces expressionless masks. They were killers who had become rescuers, and the transition was destroying them. Herr Kalu, Mansman reported, climbing to the bridge. U-506 is signaling. Kapitänleutnant Werner requests permission to come alongside. Granted. Clear some space on the starboard side. Transfer some of our lifeboats to him if possible. As U-506 approached, Hartenstein could see it was in the same condition as his own boat packed with survivors, lifeboats in tow, sitting dangerously low in the water. The 2 submarines were combat vessels designed to sink ships, now transformed into refugee boats carrying hundreds of enemies they'd sworn to destroy. Werner appeared on U-506 bridge, shouting across the water. Werner, this is insane. We have over 150 aboard and another 100 in boats. How many did you get? 193 aboard, 200 in boats. U-507 should arrive within the hour. The Vichy ships. 24 hours out, maybe more. Werderman shook his head. We can't stay on the surface that long. One Allied patrol plane and we're finished. Hartenstein knew he was right. Every hour they spent on the surface, they were vulnerable. But what was the alternative? Dive and abandon hundreds of survivors to slow death in the Atlantic? He'd already committed to this course. There was no turning back. We stay until the French arrive, Hartenstein called back. Donitz authorized it. Donitz is not sitting on the surface with submarines full of survivors waiting for Allied bombers. But Werderman was already organizing his crew, transferring supplies to the lifeboats, redistributing survivors to make room for more. The German Navy was conducting the largest rescue operation in submarine warfare history, and they were doing it in enemy-controlled waters. At 8:15 a.m., U-507 arrived under the command of Korvettenkapitän Harro Schacht. His submarine was slightly larger than the others, and he'd taken advantage of the extra space. He had 142 survivors packed aboard and another 150 in tow. The 3 U-boats now formed a bizarre flotilla, surrounded by nearly 20 lifeboats, all packed with survivors. Schacht was the senior officer present, and he took command of the operation with Prussian efficiency. Using signal flags and shouted orders, he organized the submarines into a protective formation. U-156 in the center, flying a large Red Cross flag made from bed sheets. U-506 and U-507 on either side, also displaying Red Cross markings. The lifeboats were arranged in groups, with the strongest rowers assigned to keep them together. We're sitting ducks, Schacht signaled to Hartenstein. But we're sitting ducks with Red Cross flags and hundreds of women and children visible from the air. No Allied pilot would attack this. The Geneva Convention is clear. Hartenstein wanted to believe that. But he'd seen what happened to the Laconia, a ship that should have been marked as carrying prisoners, that should have had some kind of protection, but didn't. The British had mixed military and civilian, combatants and non-combatants, all together. What if the Allies decided the submarines were legitimate targets regardless of who was aboard? The survivors themselves represented every nationality involved in the Mediterranean War. Italian soldiers captured in North Africa after Rommel's defeats. British troops being rotated home after service in Egypt. Polish guards who had fled to Britain after their country fell in 1939. British civilians evacuating from Egypt as Rommel threatened Alexandria. Women and children. Merchant sailors. Military nurses. All of them now dependent on 3 German submarines for survival. Among the Italian prisoners was Tenente Colonnello Giuseppe Spadoni, the ranking Italian officer aboard the Laconia. He'd been captured at Tobruk in June 1942 and was being transported to a POW camp in South Africa. When Hartenstein learned this, he invited Spadoni to the bridge. The Italian officer was in his 40s, gray-haired, dignified despite his oil-stained uniform. He saluted Hartenstein with perfect military courtesy. Capitano, Spadoni said in heavily accented German. I must thank you. You have saved nearly 200 of my men. How many Italians were aboard? Hartenstein asked. Spadoni's face darkened. 1,809. We were told the ship was under Red Cross protection. We were told no submarine would attack because we were prisoners of war. The British lied. The British should have notified us, Hartenstein said bitterly. Should have sent word through neutral channels that they were transporting prisoners. This never should have happened. But it did happen. And now? Spadoni gestured at the ocean around them, at the hundreds of men still in the water, at the bodies floating among the debris. Now we count the cost of British arrogance. One of the most haunting presences was the civilian families. 17 children had been aboard the Laconia, ranging from infants to teenagers. British families evacuating from Egypt, colonial administrators fleeing the advancing Afrika Korps. By dawn on September 13th, only 6 children had been confirmed alive. The rest were presumed drowned. One of the survivors was Lady Grizzle Wolfe-Murray, wife of a British colonial official, traveling with her 14-year-old daughter Molly. Both had survived, pulled from the water by U-156's crew. Lady Grizzle was upper-class British aristocracy, the kind of woman who had never done manual labor, who had servants for everything, who represented everything the Nazis claimed to oppose about British imperialism. She approached Hartenstein on the bridge, her daughter beside her. Both were wrapped in German Navy blankets, their hair still matted with oil. "Captain," she said in perfect, clipped English. "I understand you speak English." "Yes, madam. I want you to know that you and your crew have behaved with honor and dignity that puts my own government to shame. They packed us like cattle onto that ship. Military, prisoners, civilians, all mixed together. No protection. No warning. When I questioned it, I was told not to worry, that the ship was too fast for submarines." Her voice broke slightly. "My son was aboard. He was 7 years old. I have not found him." Hartenstein had no words. What could he say? That he was sorry he'd torpedoed her son? That he hoped the boy was alive in one of the lifeboats they hadn't found yet? That this was war and these things happened? "We're still looking," he said finally. "The French ships will be here tomorrow. They'll search the entire area." Lady Grizzle studied his face for a long moment. "You're a good man, Captain. This war has made us all do terrible things. But you're trying to make it right. That matters." She took her daughter's hand and descended below, leaving Hartenstein alone with his guilt. By mid-morning, the rescue operation had taken on an almost surreal quality. German sailors were teaching Italian soldiers drinking songs. British nurses were flirting with U-boat officers. Polish guards were sharing cigarettes with German submariners who would have killed them yesterday. The boundaries of war had dissolved, replaced by the simple human need for survival and connection. In the forward torpedo room of U-156, an extraordinary scene was unfolding. Doris Hawkins, the British nurse, was performing emergency surgery on an Italian soldier who had a piece of shrapnel embedded in his abdomen. The patient was lying on a torpedo, unconscious from morphine. Doris was being assisted by U-156 medical orderly, Sanitätsmat Fischer, who spoke no English. They were communicating through gestures and broken Latin medical terminology. "Scalpel," Doris said, holding out her hand. Fischer handed her a blade sterilized in grain alcohol. She made an incision, blood welling up immediately. Fischer provided suction using a rubber tube and manual pump. Around them, a dozen survivors watched in silence. Italians, British, Germans, all united in hoping this one man would survive. Doris worked for 20 minutes, her hands steady despite the submarine's gentle rolling. Finally, she extracted a jagged piece of metal the size of a thumb. "Got it," she said, holding it up. The watchers erupted in cheers, applause echoing through the torpedo room. Fischer looked at her with undisguised admiration. "Gut. Very gut, Fraulein." She smiled tiredly. "Thank you. Now we just need to keep him from getting infected. Do you have any sulfur powder?" They didn't. German submarines carried minimal medical supplies. But Fischer improvised with iodine and clean bandages, and the Italian soldiers' vital signs remained stable. It was a small victory in a sea of tragedy, but it mattered. On the surface, Hartenstein continued broadcasting his position and status every 30 minutes. The messages were being picked up by ships and stations across the South Atlantic. Some were offering help. Others were simply acknowledging receipt. But one station remained ominously silent. Ascension Island. The British air base on Ascension Island was only 700 miles northeast of their position, well within range of B-24 Liberator bombers. Those aircraft had been patrolling the South Atlantic for months, hunting U-boats. The British had to be hearing Hartenstein's broadcasts. They knew exactly where 3 German submarines were sitting on the surface. And they weren't responding. "Sir," the radio operator called up to the bridge. "We're receiving a message from BDU. It's urgent." Hartenstein descended to the radio room. The message from Donitz was brief and ominous. U-156, 506, 507. British aware your position. Ascension Island likely to dispatch aircraft. Maintain Red Cross display. Do not submerge unless directly attacked. French ships have been delayed. New ETA 36 to 48 hours. Continue rescue. Dunnits. 36 to 48 hours. 2 more days on the surface, waiting for French ships that might not arrive in time, with British bombers potentially already in the air. Hartenstein returned to the bridge and signaled the other submarines. They conferred briefly, and the decision was unanimous. They would stay. They had committed to this rescue, and German naval officers did not abandon their duty, even suicidal duty. By noon on September 13th, the count was staggering. U-156, 193 survivors aboard, 200 in towed lifeboats. U-506, 142 survivors aboard, 130 in towed lifeboats. U-507, 135 survivors aboard, 150 in towed lifeboats. Independent lifeboats and rafts, approximately 400 to 500 survivors scattered across 10 square miles. Total rescued, approximately 1,350 people. But the original passenger manifest for the Laconia listed 2,732 souls aboard. The missing 1,382 were presumed dead. Drowned in the initial sinking, pulled down by the ship's final plunge, or died during the night from hypothermia, shock, or drowning. The bodies floated among the living, a constant reminder of the cost. At 2:30 p.m., a lookout on U-507 spotted something on the horizon. He called down to Schacht, who raised his binoculars and studied the distant speck. Aircraft, Schacht signaled to the other submarines. Single engine. Possibly reconnaissance. All 3 submarine commanders watched as the aircraft approached, growing larger, more distinct. It was a British Sunderland flying boat, a long-range patrol aircraft often used for anti-submarine warfare. Red Cross flags are displayed, Hartenstein confirmed. Everyone on deck, make yourselves visible. We want them to see we're conducting rescue operations. The Sunderland circled once at a distance of perhaps 2 miles, low enough that the crew could clearly see the submarines, the lifeboats, the hundreds of people in the water. Then it circled again, closer, and Hartenstein could see the pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, looking down at the bizarre scene. The aircraft waggled its wings, the international signal for acknowledgement, and flew off to the northeast, back toward Ascension Island. They saw us, Werderman signaled. They know what we're doing. No attack. They'll report our position, Schacht replied. Higher command will make the decision. Hartenstein watched the Sunderland disappear over the horizon. The pilot had seen everything. The Red Cross flags. The women and children. The rescue operation. He would report back to his commanders, and they would have to decide. Attack 3 submarines conducting a rescue operation, killing hundreds of survivors in the process? Or honor the unwritten rules of maritime warfare and allow the rescue to continue? Hartenstein wanted to believe humanity would prevail. That even in the midst of total war, some lines wouldn't be crossed. That the sight of women and children would stay the hand of vengeance. But he'd been at war for 3 years. He'd seen what men were capable of when orders conflicted with conscience. And he knew that somewhere on Ascension Island, a bomber crew was probably being briefed for a mission. The sun was beginning to set on September 13th when the radio crackled with a new message. It was from the Vichy French cruiser Gloire. U-boat rescue force, have received clearance from British Admiralty to conduct rescue operations in your area. Request you maintain position until our arrival. ETA now 24 hours. Do not engage Allied ships or aircraft. Gloire actual. Hartenstein read the message 3 times. The British Admiralty had given permission for French ships to conduct the rescue. That implied the British wouldn't interfere. That the submarines would be allowed to continue unmolested until the French arrived. It was over. They'd succeeded. Against all odds, all expectations, all military logic, they'd pulled off the rescue. In 24 hours, French ships would arrive, take aboard all the survivors, and the submarines could dive and escape. Hartenstein allowed himself a moment of relief. They'd done it. They'd saved over 1,000 people. Yes, more than 1,000 had died, but 1,300 lived because 3 German submarines had abandoned their war for 3 days. He drafted a response to be sent to all parties. To all ships, rescue operations continuing. Estimated 1,350 survivors secured. Will maintain position until French arrival. No hostile actions. Respectfully, Hartenstein, U-156. As night fell on September 13th, the second night of the rescue, the submarines settled into a routine. Survivors who were strong enough took turns rowing the lifeboats, keeping them together, searching for any missed survivors. The weakest remained aboard the submarines, receiving what medical care was possible. Food was shared, German rations supplemented by supplies salvaged from the Laconia's lifeboats. An Italian soldier with a beautiful tenor voice began singing O Sole Mio from one of the lifeboats. Others joined in. Then someone started Lili Marleen, the song beloved by soldiers of all nationalities. Soon hundreds of voices were singing together, Italian, German, English, Polish, all in different languages but the same melody. Enemies singing together in the middle of the Atlantic, waiting for rescue, united by survival. Hartenstein stood on the bridge, listening. This was what war should end, he thought. Not with victory or defeat, but with moments like this. Recognition that we're all just humans trying to survive. That the uniforms and flags and ideologies mean nothing when you're drowning together. Beautiful, isn't it? A voice said beside him. He turned. It was Doris Hawkins, the British nurse. She'd come up for air, her face still streaked with oil but her eyes clear. Yes, Hartenstein said. Beautiful and tragic. Why tragic? Because tomorrow or the next day, we'll go back to trying to kill each other. This moment of grace will end, and the war will continue. Doris looked at him thoughtfully. Maybe. But everyone here will remember this. We'll remember that the enemy saved us. That humanity existed even in the middle of horror. Maybe that matters more than we think. She was right, Hartenstein realized. Whatever happened after this, whoever won or lost the war, the people here would remember. Would tell their children and grandchildren about the night German submarines rescued British survivors. About singing together in the darkness. About grace in the middle of war. It would matter. As the second night wore on, the submarines rocked gently on the swells, surrounded by lifeboats full of survivors. The ocean had calmed. The stars were brilliant overhead. And for a brief moment, peace existed in the middle of the Atlantic. But 700 miles to the northeast, on Ascension Island, a B-24 Liberator bomber was being fueled and armed for a morning patrol. And its orders were very specific. September 14, 1942. 11:23 a.m. South Atlantic. The morning had dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect tropical day that made men forget they were in the middle of a war zone. U-156 wallowed gently on the calm sea, its deck still packed with survivors taking advantage of the sunshine to dry their clothes and warm their bodies after 2 nights of exposure. Hartenstein had finally allowed himself to sleep for 3 hours, trusting the watch to wake him if anything changed. When he returned to the bridge at 10 a.m., the situation was unchanged. The submarines maintained their formation, the lifeboats stayed close, and the survivors were in surprisingly good spirits considering what they'd endured. The French ships were now less than 12 hours away. By midnight, this would all be over. Herr Kalu, the lookout, called from his post. Aircraft. Bearing 045. Distance approximately 10 kilometers. Hartenstein raised his binoculars, scanning the northeastern sky. There a dark speck against the blue, growing larger. A 4-engine aircraft. Heavy bomber profile. Probably a B-24 Liberator from Ascension Island. Battle stations, Hartenstein ordered out of instinct, then immediately countermanded himself. Belay that. Everyone remain calm. Display the Red Cross flags. Get as many survivors visible on deck as possible. He watched the aircraft approach, his stomach tight with anxiety. The bomber was close enough now that he could see details: the twin tail, the deep fuselage, the gun turrets. A B-24D, probably from the American 343rd Bombardment Squadron based on Ascension. They'd been hunting U-boats in these waters for months. The bomber circled once at about 3,000 feet, well within visual range. Through his binoculars, Hartenstein could see the crew moving in the cockpit, the ball turret gunner rotating his position to look down at them. They had to see everything: the Red Cross flags, the hundreds of survivors on the submarine's decks, the lifeboats filled with women and children. "He sees us," Mansman said quietly. "He has to see what we're doing." The bomber completed its circle and began to climb, turning northeast. Back toward Ascension. "His leaving," Hartenstein said, releasing a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "His going to report back." "Where?" The bomber leveled off at about 5,000 feet and turned back toward them. "Herr Kalu," the lookout said, his voice tight. "His coming back. And his bomb bay is opening." Time seemed to stop. Hartenstein stared through his binoculars at the B-24, watching the bomb bay doors swing open. He could see the dark shapes of bombs nestled in the bay. Could see the bomber's nose dropping slightly as it lined up for an attack run. "His attacking," Hartenstein said, his voice hollow. "Everyone off the deck. Clear the deck. All survivors into the water. Now." The command was repeated in German, Italian, and English. Survivors scrambled in panic, some jumping directly into the water, others climbing down hastily into the lifeboats. The deck cleared in seconds as German sailors pushed British nurses and Italian soldiers over the side, not gently but desperately, trying to save them from what was coming. "Dive the boat!" Hartenstein shouted. "Emergency dive!" But even as he gave the order, he knew it was impossible. They had lifeboats tied to the submarine. They had 193 people below decks who would drown if they submerged. They couldn't dive without killing everyone they'd saved. "Belay that," he countermanded. "Cut the tow lines. Cut them now." Sailors hacked at the ropes connecting the lifeboats to the submarine. The boats drifted free, their occupants screaming in terror and confusion. On the other submarines, Werdeman and Schacht were facing the same impossible choice. Save themselves or save the survivors. There wasn't time to do both. The B-24 was in its bombing run now, dropping from 5,000 feet, the pilot lining up on U-156. Hartenstein could see everything with terrible clarity: the sun glinting off the cockpit, the bomb bay open like a mouth, the bomber growing larger with each second. "All hands brace for impact," Hartenstein shouted. The first bomb fell. It was a near miss, striking the water 20 meters off U-156's starboard side. The explosion lifted a column of water 30 meters high, the shock wave hitting the submarine like a hammer. Men were thrown from their feet. Equipment crashed loose. The submarine rolled hard to port, water cascading over the deck. The second bomb fell. This one hit a lifeboat. The lifeboat disintegrated. 43 people, Italian soldiers, British sailors, 2 nurses, and 1 child ceased to exist in a fraction of a second. Body parts, shattered wood, and red-stained water marked where they had been. Hartenstein watched it happen, unable to look away, unable to process what he was seeing. The bomber had just killed 43 survivors. Had deliberately dropped a bomb on a lifeboat full of women and children clearly visible from the air. The third bomb fell, targeting U-506. It missed by 10 meters, but the near miss was devastating. The submarine's pressure hull cracked, flooding began in the aft compartments, and the boat started settling by the stern. Werdeman ordered an emergency surface blow, but water was gaining faster than the pumps could handle. "We're sinking." Werdeman signaled desperately. "I have to get these people off." The fourth bomb fell. This one hit the water between 2 lifeboats, the explosion flipping both boats and hurling their occupants into the sea. Dozens of survivors who had just escaped drowning 2 days ago were now drowning again, stunned by the blast, unable to swim. The B-24 pulled out of its dive and began to climb for another run. "His coming back," Mansman said, his voice shaking. "He's going to keep bombing until he kills us all." Hartenstein faced the most terrible decision of his life. If he stayed on the surface, the bomber would eventually hit them, sinking the submarine and killing everyone aboard his crew and the 193 survivors below decks. If he dove, he'd save his crew but abandon hundreds of survivors to their fate. There was no good choice. Only degrees of horror. Signal the other boats, Hartenstein said, his voice dead. All submarines dive immediately. Cut all lines. Release all survivors. Every man for himself. Sir. Do it. The order went out by signal flags. On U-506 and U-507, commanders made the same agonizing decision. Lifeboats were cut loose. Survivors on deck were ordered into the water. The submarines began their emergency dives. On U-156 deck, the remaining survivors were climbing down into lifeboats or jumping into the water. Doris Hawkins appeared on the bridge, her face streaked with tears. "You're leaving us," she said. "Not an accusation. Just a statement of fact." "I have no choice," Hartenstein said. "If I stay, we all die. The bomber will sink us." "I know," she said quietly. "I understand. Thank you for trying, Captain. You're still a good man." She climbed down to the deck and jumped into the water, swimming toward the nearest lifeboat. Hartenstein watched her go, this British nurse who had thanked him even as he abandoned her. "Dive the boat," Hartenstein ordered. "Take her down to 50 meters. Silent running." U-156 slid beneath the surface, leaving behind hundreds of survivors scattered across the ocean. Behind them, U-506 was sinking, Werderman having lost the fight against the flooding. His crew and the survivors aboard were abandoning ship, jumping into an ocean that now contained one fewer rescue vessel. U-507 managed to dive successfully, but Schacht had been forced to leave 150 survivors on the surface. In total, over 600 survivors were now back in the water, 2 days after being rescued, watching their rescuers disappear beneath the waves. At 50 meters depth, Hartenstein listened to the horror above through the hydrophones. The B-24 was making another bombing run. He heard the explosions, 1, 2, 3 more bombs hitting the water. He heard the screaming, faint but audible through the steel hull. He heard the bomber's engines circling, searching, hunting. In the control room, silence. His crew stood at their stations, faces blank, not looking at each other. They knew what they'd just done. What they'd been forced to do. "Herr Kalu," the hydrophone operator said quietly. "The bomber's leaving. Heading northeast." Hartenstein waited 10 minutes, then 15. Finally, he gave the order. "Surface the boat. Carefully. Watch for aircraft." U-156 rose slowly, cautiously, breaking the surface into a scene of devastation. The ocean was littered with debris, bodies, and overturned lifeboats. The survivors who remained were scattered, many injured from the bombing, all traumatized. But the bomber was gone. "Resume rescue operations," Hartenstein ordered, his voice hollow. "Get everyone we can back aboard." They pulled people from the water for the second time in 3 days. Many of the survivors they'd rescued before were dead now, killed by the American bombs. Others were wounded, shrapnel injuries, blast trauma, broken bones from being thrown by explosions. Doris Hawkins was alive, pulled from the water again by the same German sailors who had saved her before. She climbed aboard without a word, her face blank with shock. Lady Grizzle Wolfe-Murray was alive. Her daughter Molly was dead, killed by the second bomb that hit the lifeboat. Lady Grizzle said nothing. She simply sat on the deck, staring at nothing, her mind broken. Tenente Colonnello Spadoni was wounded, a piece of shrapnel in his leg, but alive. When German sailors pulled him aboard, he looked at Hartenstein and said in German, "Why? Why did they bomb us? We were being rescued." They saw the Red Cross flags. Hartenstein had no answer. U-506 was gone, sunk by the damage from the near miss. Werderman and most of his crew had survived, but 142 survivors who had been aboard when the attack began were now in the water, and many had drowned in the chaos. U-507 was still operational but had suffered damage to its pressure hull. Schacht reported he could remain on the surface but could not dive safely. The count after the American attack. Survivors killed by direct bomb hits, approximately 50 to 60. Survivors drowned in the chaos, approximately 40 to 50. Total new deaths, approximately 100. U-506, sunk. U-507, damaged, unable to dive. U-156, operational but traumatized crew. The rescue operation continued, but everything had changed. The survivors no longer sang. The German crews worked in grim silence. The fragile moment of humanity that had existed for 2 days had been shattered by 4 minutes of American bombing. At 3 p.m., Hartenstein sent a message to BDU. His report was factual, emotionless, but the horror bled through every word. BDU, U-156 attacked BY American B-24 while conducting rescue operations. Red Cross flags displayed. Lifeboats visible. Attack continued despite clear rescue situation. Approximately 100 survivors killed. U-506 sunk. U-507 damaged. Continuing rescue with remaining vessels. Request orders. Hartenstein. The response from Donitz came within an hour. It was brief. U-156, 507, discontinue rescue operations. Submerge immediately. Proceed to designated patrol areas. Survivors to be left 4 Vichy French ships. No German U-boat will conduct rescue operations in future. Donitz. Hartenstein read the order 3 times. Discontinue rescue. Leave the survivors. No future rescue operations. The rules had just changed. The American bombing had killed more than 100 survivors. It had killed the last remnant of chivalry in submarine warfare. Signal to U-507, Hartenstein said quietly. We're leaving. Transfer any survivors who can fit to the lifeboats. Give them all our remaining food and water. Signal the French ships with the exact coordinates. Then we dive. For the next 2 hours, the submarines transferred their remaining survivors to lifeboats. They gave away their food, water, medical supplies, even personal items, cigarettes, chocolate, letters to mail if they survived. The German sailors said goodbye to people they'd risked their lives to save, knowing they were leaving them to an uncertain fate. Doris Hawkins approached Hartenstein one final time before being transferred to a lifeboat. Captain, she said. What happened up there? That wasn't your fault. You tried. You did everything you could. It wasn't enough. It was enough for the 1,200 of us who are still alive. We'll remember. We'll tell people what you did. She saluted him, a British nurse saluting a German U-boat captain, and climbed down to the lifeboat. At 6 p.m. on September 14, 1942, U-156 and U-507 dove beneath the surface for the last time, leaving behind approximately 800 survivors in lifeboats and rafts, scattered across the South Atlantic, waiting for French ships that were still 12 hours away. Hartenstein set a course southwest, away from the area, away from the scene of the worst disaster and most heroic rescue of his career. His crew was silent. Many were openly weeping. They had tried to do the right thing, tried to save their enemies, and had been punished for it. In the radio room, a new message arrived from BDU. It was addressed to all U-boats in all operational areas. To all U-boat commanders, effective immediately, no attempt of any kind must be made to rescue the crews of ships sunk, and this includes picking up persons in the water and putting them in lifeboats, righting capsized lifeboats, and handing over food and water. Rescue runs counter to the primary demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and their crews. Be hard. Remember that the enemy takes no regard of women and children in his bombing attacks on German cities. Donitz. The Laconia Order. The directive that would end submarine rescue operations for the rest of the war. The order that Allied prosecutors would later cite at Nuremberg as evidence of German war crimes. All because an American bomber pilot saw Red Cross flags, saw women and children, saw a rescue operation in progress, and dropped his bombs anyway. September 16, 1942. Vichy French cruiser Gloire, South Atlantic. Captain René de Saucine stood on the bridge of his ship, staring at the scene before him with barely controlled rage. Scattered across miles of ocean were lifeboats, rafts, and debris, the remnants of what should have been a successful rescue operation. His crew was pulling survivors aboard, and the stories they told were almost impossible to believe. German submarines had saved them, had risked everything to conduct the largest rescue operation in submarine warfare history, had flown Red Cross flags and broadcast their positions in clear English, abandoning all operational security to save drowning enemies. And then an American bomber had attacked the rescue operation. How many? De Saussine asked his executive officer. We've recovered 473 so far, Captain. The Annamite has another 212. Dumont d'Urville reports 167. Total approximately 852 survivors. Less than a third of the original 2,732 aboard the Laconia. And according to survivors, at least 100 of the dead had been killed not by the torpedo, not by drowning, but by American bombs dropped during the rescue. De Saussine was technically a Vichy officer, serving the collaborationist French government under Marshal Pétain. But he was a sailor first, and sailors had rules. You rescued survivors. You didn't bomb rescue operations. You didn't kill women and children who were clearly visible in lifeboats. The American pilot, De Saussine said carefully. Do we know his name? No, Captain. The survivors saw only the aircraft. A B-24 Liberator from Ascension Island, based on the direction and timing. Find out. I want his name in my report. The survivors being brought aboard told their stories in fragments, traumatized testimonies that would haunt the French crews for years. They spoke of German sailors diving into the water to save drowning British nurses, of U-boat commanders sharing their own rations with Italian prisoners, of enemies singing together in the darkness. And then the bombs falling, the lifeboats exploding, the submarines forced to dive, abandoning the people they'd spent 2 days saving. One survivor, a British merchant sailor named Thomas Buckingham, grabbed de Saussine's arm as he was being helped aboard. The Germans saved us, Buckingham said, his eyes wild. The Germans bloody saved us, and your lot took 2 days to get here, and our lot bombed us. What kind of war is this? De Saussine had no answer. September 18, 1942. Ascension Island, British South Atlantic Command. The incident report sat on Wing Commander Reginald Pocock's desk, and he'd read it 7 times, hoping it would somehow say something different. It never did. Lieutenant James D. Harden, pilot of B-24D serial number 41 to 24047, had spotted 3 German submarines on the surface at coordinates 4 degrees 53 minutes south, 11 degrees 26 minutes west on September 14 at approximately 11:20 hours. The submarines were flying Red Cross flags and appeared to be conducting rescue operations, with numerous lifeboats in tow and hundreds of survivors visible on deck. Lieutenant Harden had radioed back to base for instructions. The response from base command had been unequivocal: attack. Submarines are legitimate military targets regardless of circumstances. Harden had followed orders. He'd dropped 6 bombs, scoring 1 direct hit on a lifeboat and several near misses on the submarines. He'd forced the submarines to dive and abandon their rescue operations. Mission successful. 3 enemy submarines denied the ability to continue operations. Strategic objective achieved. Except Vichy French ships had now recovered the survivors and were broadcasting their accounts. The French were technically neutral in the Atlantic, their ships had safe passage agreements with both sides. And they were furious. They were calling the bombing a war crime. They were threatening to share the survivors' testimonies with neutral press. And the survivors were saying things that made everyone involved look monstrous. Pocock drafted his report carefully, choosing words that would protect Harden while acknowledging the complexity of the situation. Lieutenant Harden acted in accordance with standing orders to attack enemy submarines on sight. The presence of rescue operations, while noted, did not alter the fundamental military objective of destroying enemy vessels. The submarine's decision to conduct rescue operations in hostile waters created an untenable tactical situation. The responsibility for any civilian casualties rests with the German commanders who chose to endanger non-combatants by conducting military operations in their presence. It was bureaucratic language designed to shift blame. And Pocock hated every word of it. But orders were orders. And in war, sometimes orders made you complicit in things that would have been unthinkable in peace. September 20th, 1942. U-boat headquarters, Lorient, France. Admiral Karl Donitz stood before a map of the Atlantic, red pins marking every U-boat position, black pins marking every loss. He was the supreme commander of the German submarine force, the man responsible for Germany's maritime strategy, and he had just issued an order that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Laconia order. No rescues. No mercy. Leave them to drown. His aide, Korvettenkapitän Gott, entered with the latest casualty reports. Admiral, the final accounting from the Laconia incident. U-506 lost with all hands, 52 German submariners. Approximately 1,650 to 1,700 of Laconia's passengers and crew lost. Of the survivors, approximately 100 were killed during the American bombing of the rescue operation. Donitz turned from the map, his face carved from granite. And Hartenstein. U-156 is operational, continuing patrol. But the crew is damaged, sir. They watched the Americans bomb survivors they'd spent 2 days saving. Some of the men are requesting transfer to surface ships. They don't want to serve on U-boats anymore. Denied. We need every experienced submariner we have. Sir, with respect, the Laconia order is necessary, Donitz snapped. Hartenstein did the honorable thing. The human thing. And it nearly cost us 3 submarines and their crews. We cannot afford such losses. This is total war, Gott. The British bomb our cities with women and children inside. The Americans apparently bomb rescue operations. We do not have the luxury of chivalry anymore. The order will be used against us after the war, sir. If we lose, we hang anyway. The order stands. Gott saluted and left. Alone, Donitz returned to staring at his map. He'd served in U-boats in the First World War. He remembered when submarines still followed the cruiser rules, surfacing to warn merchant ships, allowing crews to abandon before sinking their vessels. Those days were gone, killed by aircraft and depth charges and the brutal mathematics of total war. The Laconia incident had just killed the last remnant of maritime honor. And Donitz knew, even as he issued the order, that history would judge him for it. Prosecutors at some future tribunal would cite the Laconia order as proof of German barbarity. They would ignore the context, that the order came after Americans bombed a rescue operation. They would ignore that Hartenstein had tried to do the right thing and been punished for it. They would only see the words, "No attempt of any kind must be made to rescue." And they would call it a war crime. October 1942. London, British Admiralty. The classified report on the Laconia incident landed on dozens of desks throughout British Naval Command. Most recipients read it once, filed it under sensitive matters, and never spoke of it again. But one reader, Commander Ian Fleming of Naval Intelligence, wrote a brief memo that would remain classified for 50 years. The Laconia incident represents a failure of military intelligence and humanitarian principle. A ship carrying 1,809 Italian POWs, 268 British troops, 80 civilians including women and children, and 103 Polish guards should never have been allowed to transit submarine-infested waters without proper notification to enemy forces through neutral channels. The subsequent German rescue attempt demonstrated unexpected chivalry. The American bombing of said rescue operation, while tactically justifiable under strict military doctrine, represents a moral failure that will haunt this service. We have allowed operational expediency to override humanitarian law. The Germans will cite this incident to justify their own future atrocities. We have given them the moral high ground, and they earned it by attempting to rescue our people. Recommendation: this incident should be classified top secret indefinitely. Public knowledge would severely damage Allied morale and provide enemy propaganda victory. All surviving witnesses should be debriefed and instructed that discussing details constitutes breach of Official Secrets Act. The truth is too damaging to admit. Fleming's recommendation was accepted. The Laconia incident disappeared into classified files, buried under stamps marked secret and eyes only. The truth would remain hidden for decades. November 1942. Cape Town, South Africa. Lady Grizel Wolfe-Murray sat in a hospital room, staring at nothing. They'd given her sedatives, counseling, medical care. None of it helped. Her son was dead, drowned when the Laconia sank. Her daughter was dead, killed by an American bomb that hit their lifeboat during a rescue operation. She'd survived. Rescued twice, once by German sailors who risked their lives, once by French sailors who arrived too late. A British intelligence officer came to interview her, a young man with kind eyes and a clipboard full of forms. Lady Wolfe-Murray, I need to ask you about your experience. For the official record. What do you want to know? Her voice was flat, emotionless. The German submarine that rescued you. Did they treat you properly? They saved my life. Twice. They pulled me from the water, gave me blankets, shared their food. The captain spoke to me personally, promised they'd get help. They did everything they could. And the American aircraft? She looked at him directly for the first time. The American aircraft killed my daughter. She was in a lifeboat, clearly visible, waving a white cloth. The plane dropped a bomb directly on us. Molly was 14 years old. The officer wrote carefully, I'm very sorry for your loss. For the official record, we need to characterize the German actions as heroic, Lady Grizel interrupted. Write that down. The Germans acted with honor. We acted with shame. My government put us on that ship, mixed military and civilian, gave the Germans no warning. And when the Germans tried to save us, our allies bombed them. Lady Wolfe-Murray, that's not. Get out. Get out. The officer left. His report would describe Lady Grizel as mentally unbalanced by trauma and her testimony as unreliable. The truth was too complicated. Too damaging. Easier to bury it. December 1942. U-156, South Atlantic Patrol. Hartenstein stood on the bridge of his submarine, 3 months after the Laconia incident, and wondered if he'd made the right choice. They'd saved approximately 1,100 people, 1,200 if you counted those who survived until the French ships arrived. But 1,650 had died. And the Laconia order meant that any future survivors from U-boat attacks would simply be left to drown. How many would die because he'd tried to do the right thing? His crew had changed. They still performed their duties with German efficiency, but the spirit was different. They followed the Laconia order religiously. When they sank a ship, they dove immediately without looking back. No rescue attempts. No checking for survivors. Just sink and run. They'd become killers again. The brief moment when they'd been rescuers was over. Mansman appeared on the bridge with a message. Herr Kalu, BDU reports that Lieutenant Harden, the American pilot who bombed us, has been awarded the Air Medal for successfully attacking enemy submarines. They're calling him a hero. Hartenstein said nothing. What was there to say? The man who had bombed women and children in lifeboats was being decorated. The U-boat commander who had tried to save them had issued orders to never rescue anyone again. There's more, sir, Mansman continued. British Admiralty has announced that any U-boat conducting rescue operations will be considered to have surrendered its combatant status and may be attacked without restriction. So there it was. Official policy. If you try to save them, we'll kill you. Very well, Hartenstein said quietly. From now on, we follow the Laconia order absolutely. No rescue attempts under any circumstances. Even if we torpedo another ship with prisoners? With civilians? Hartenstein looked at his executive officer. Especially then. We tried mercy once. It cost us a submarine, killed 100 survivors, and earned us medals from the enemy. We won't make that mistake again. But even as he said the words, Hartenstein knew he would carry the Laconia with him forever. The faces of the survivors. The Italian captain thanking him. The British nurse calling him a good man. Lady Grizzle's daughter waving from the lifeboat seconds before the bomb hit. He'd tried to do the right thing in a war that had no room for right things. And everyone involved except the man who dropped the bombs would pay the price. March 15, 1943. Cape Town, South Africa. POW Camp 17. Tenente Colonnello Giuseppe Spadoni sat in the camp commander's office, facing a tribunal of British officers who didn't seem to know whether to treat him as a war criminal or a victim. His leg still hadn't fully healed from the shrapnel wound he'd received during the American bombing. Colonel Spadoni, the senior British officer, began, "We need your official statement regarding the sinking of RMS Laconia for our records." Spadoni looked at the three officers, their uniforms immaculate, their faces betraying no emotion. They wanted an official statement. Sanitized. Politically acceptable. Something that wouldn't embarrass anyone. He was going to tell them the truth instead. "We were lied to," Spadoni began, his English heavily accented but clear. "The British Guards told us the Laconia was protected under Red Cross conventions. They told us no U-boat would attack because we were prisoners of war. They told us we were safe. The ship was following standard procedures. The ship was a death trap." Spadoni's voice rose. "You put 1,809 Italian prisoners in the holds, mixed with British troops, Polish guards, civilian families, women, and children. No Red Cross markings. No notification to Germany through neutral channels. You disguised a prison ship as a military transport and sent it through submarine-infested waters. Colonel, we cannot notify the enemy of every troop movement. Then do not put prisoners of war on those ships." Spadoni slammed his hand on the desk. "The Geneva Convention is clear. You violated it, not the Germans. And when your violation got us torpedoed, it was a German submarine commander who saved us." The British officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was not going according to plan. The German submarine, the senior officer said carefully, was responsible for sinking the ship in the first place. "Yes. And then he spent 3 days saving us. 3 days on the surface, broadcasting in English, flying Red Cross flags, taking aboard his enemies while your Admiralty did nothing." Spadoni leaned forward. "Do you know what the German commander said to me? He said, 'I am a naval officer, not a murderer. There are rules, even in war.' He had more honor than the people who put us on that ship." "That's quite enough, Colonel. I am not finished." Spadoni's voice was ice. "Your American allies bombed us. They saw the Red Cross flags. They saw women and children in lifeboats. They saw submarines conducting a rescue operation. And they dropped bombs on us anyway. 43 people in my lifeboat died. I watched a 5-year-old girl disintegrate. Her name was Sophie Walder. She was German, daughter of a colonial administrator. The Americans killed her while Germans were trying to save her." Silence filled the room. "My official statement is this. The British government's criminal negligence killed 1,650 people. The German submarine commander's heroism saved 1,100. The American bombing murdered 100 more. Those are the facts. Write them down or don't. But I will tell this story to everyone who asks until the day I die." The tribunal ended shortly after. Spadoni's testimony was classified unreliable due to obvious bias and buried in classified files. But Spadoni kept his promise. He told the story to every prisoner in the camp, to every Red Cross inspector who visited, to every journalist who would listen after the war. The truth couldn't be buried completely, not when 1,100 survivors carried it with them. May 1943. Boston, Massachusetts. Naval Hospital. Doris Hawkins sat on the edge of her hospital bed, staring at the letter in her hands. She'd been repatriated to the United States, one of the British nurses who'd survived the Laconia. The Navy wanted her to do propaganda speeches, talk about the evil Germans who torpedoed a helpless ship, the brave Americans who fought them, the triumph of Allied determination. They didn't want her to tell the truth. The letter was from the U.S. Navy Public Relations Office, outlining what she should and should not say. Approved topics: the terror of the torpedo attack, the courage of British sailors, the horror of being in enemy hands, gratitude for American forces. Prohibited topics: German rescue efforts, treatment by German crew, American bombing of rescue operations, any criticism of Allied conduct. A Navy lieutenant commander named Harrison had visited her that morning with a simple message: "Nurse Hawkins, we need heroes and villains. The Germans are the villains. Keep it simple for the public." "But that's not what happened," Doris had replied. "That's what needs to happen in the official record." She'd thrown him out of her room. Now she sat with the letter, trying to decide what to do. Tell the truth and face court-martial for divulging classified information? Or lie and betray the German sailors who had risked their lives to save her? She thought about Hartenstein standing on his bridge, exhausted, guilty, but determined. "I am a naval officer, not a murderer." She thought about the German sailors forming human chains, diving into the water repeatedly, sharing their rations with enemies. She thought about the American bombs falling on lifeboats full of women and children. Doris Hawkins crumpled the Navy's letter and threw it in the trash. She gave no propaganda speeches. She told no heroic tales. When reporters asked about her experience, she said only, "War is complicated. People are complicated. I survived. Many didn't. That's all." And at night, alone, she cried for the German captain she would never see again, the man who had shown her that honor still existed even in the middle of hell. August 1943. Washington, D.C. Naval Intelligence. The classified file on Lieutenant James D. Harden sat in a locked safe in the basement of the Navy Department building. Only 7 people had clearance to access it, and all of them wished it didn't exist. The file contained Harden's after-action report, describing the bombing of 3 German submarines conducting alleged rescue operations. Intercepted German radio traffic from the incident. Testimony from 127 survivors describing the rescue and subsequent bombing. Photographs from French rescue ships showing the destruction. Vichy French diplomatic protests. Internal Navy assessment of the incident. The assessment, written by Captain William J. McNally, was brutal in its honesty. Lieutenant Harden's actions, while technically in compliance with standing orders to attack enemy submarines on sight, represent a catastrophic failure of judgment and humanity. The presence of Red Cross flags, hundreds of visible survivors on deck, and lifeboats in tow clearly indicated a rescue operation in progress. The Geneva Convention is explicit: rescue operations enjoy protected status. Lieutenant Harden radioed base for instructions and was ordered to attack. This order came from Redacted, who has since been reassigned to administrative duties. The order represents either A. Failure to understand the tactical situation, B. Deliberate decision to attack protected rescue operations, C. Prioritization of military objectives over humanitarian law. Regardless of intent, the result is that American forces killed approximately 100 survivors during a rescue operation, provided enemy propaganda with legitimate grievance, and contributed directly to Germany's Laconia order ending all submarine rescue operations. Strategic assessment: this incident has cost more Allied lives than it saved. German submarines that previously conducted occasional rescue operations will now leave all survivors to drown. Conservative estimates suggest 1,000 plus additional Allied merchant seamen will die due to the precedent set by this attack. Recommendation: incident should remain classified indefinitely. Lieutenant Harden should be quietly reassigned to non-combat duties. Officers involved in issuing attack orders should be removed from tactical decision-making roles. Public acknowledgement would damage Allied morale, provide enemy propaganda victory, and potentially constitute admission of war crime under Geneva Convention. The recommendation was accepted. The file was sealed. The incident never happened, officially. Lieutenant Harden received his Air Medal in a quiet ceremony with no press present. He was then transferred to a training squadron in California, far from combat operations. He never flew another combat mission. He never spoke publicly about September 14, 1942. But according to his squadron mates, he woke up screaming most nights for the rest of his life. November 1943. Berlin, Propaganda Ministry. Joseph Goebbels stood before his assembled staff, holding a folder marked Laconia, Intelligence Summary. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction, "the Americans have handed us a gift. A perfect propaganda gift." The folder contained everything German intelligence had compiled about the Laconia incident: survivor testimonies, intercepted Allied communications, photographs from Vichy French ships, and most damning of all, Allied attempts to suppress the truth. "We have," Goebbels continued, "irrefutable proof that German submarine officers acted with honor while Allied forces acted with barbarism. German sailors risked their lives to save drowning enemies: British, Italian, Polish, civilian, military, men, women, and children. They broadcast their positions, flew Red Cross flags, followed every provision of international law." He paused for effect. "And the Americans bombed them. Deliberately. Knowingly. They killed women and children in lifeboats. They attacked a protected rescue operation. And then they tried to hide it." "Minister," one aide asked, "should we release this to neutral press? The propaganda value." "No," Goebbels interrupted sharply. "We release nothing." Confused silence filled the room. "Why not, Minister?" Goebbels smiled coldly. "Because the truth is more valuable than propaganda. Right now, Allied commanders know we have this information. They know we could release it at any time. They know their own actions created the moral high ground for us." He tossed the folder onto the table. "We hold this in reserve. Every time the Americans accuse us of submarine atrocities, we mention Laconia. Every time the British claim German barbarity, we reference Laconia. We never give them the full story that would allow them to spin it, contextualize it, bury it in propaganda. Instead, we let it hang over them like a sword. The incident they are terrified the world will learn about." It was brilliantly cynical. The truth became a weapon precisely because it remained hidden. Partial revelation, strategic leaks, implied threats, these were more powerful than full disclosure. For the rest of the war, whenever Allied propaganda became too effective, German diplomats would mention certain incidents in the Atlantic to neutral observers. They never explained. Never elaborated. Just dropped the hint and watched Allied diplomats scramble to change the subject. The full truth remained classified on both sides, each government terrified of what complete disclosure would reveal about their own conduct. December 1943. U-156, returning to base, Bay of Biscay. Werner Hartenstein stood on the bridge of his submarine, watching the French coast materialize through the morning mist. They were returning from another patrol, another 3 months of hunting Allied shipping. Another 3 months of following the Laconia order. They'd sunk 4 ships. Over 200 merchant sailors had gone into the water. U-156 had dove immediately each time, following orders, abandoning the survivors without checking if anyone needed help. Hartenstein didn't know how many had survived. Didn't let himself think about it. "Herr Kalu," Mansman said quietly, "message from BDU. We're being reassigned after this patrol. You're being given a staff position at headquarters." Hartenstein understood immediately. They were taking him out of combat. Not as punishment. His record was exemplary: 14 ships sunk, over 100,000 tons, Knight's Cross recommended. They were removing him because the Laconia had broken something in him, and Donitz knew it. "Who's getting U-156? Oberleutnant Witt. Young, aggressive, no combat experience with rescue operations. Of course. A new commander who didn't carry the guilt of Laconia. Who would follow the Laconia order without hesitation because he'd never tried to save anyone." "Very well," Hartenstein said. "Signal acknowledgement." As U-156 approached Lorient, Hartenstein looked back at the Atlantic one final time. Somewhere out there, in the cold water, were the ghosts of 1,650 people who had died because the British put them on the wrong ship at the wrong time. and the ghosts of 100 more who had died because an American pilot followed orders without thinking. He wondered if Doris Hawkins had survived. If Lady Grizzle had recovered from losing both her children. If Spadoni was still in a POW camp, still telling the truth to anyone who would listen. He wondered if the world would ever know what really happened. And he wondered if it mattered. The truth was classified. The survivors were scattered. The witnesses were threatened into silence. The incident was buried under stamps marked secret. But Hartenstein knew. His crew knew. The 1,100 survivors knew. You couldn't bury the truth completely when more than 1,000 people carried it with them. Someday, he thought, someday the truth will come out. And people will judge us, all of us. German, British, American. They'll judge the submarine captain who torpedoed a ship full of prisoners. They'll judge the government that put prisoners on that ship without warning. They'll judge the pilot who bombed a rescue operation. They'll judge everyone involved. And no one will emerge looking heroic. Just humans. Making terrible choices in an impossible situation. Trying to do right in a war that made right and wrong meaningless. U-156 entered Lorient Harbor on December 18, 1943. Werner Hartenstein would never command a submarine again. On March 6, 1944, while serving at headquarters, he would be killed when Allied bombers hit the U-boat bunkers. He died at his desk, working on logistics reports, far from the sea he loved. He never learned that his actions on September 12 to 14, 1942, saved exactly 1,113 people, a number that wouldn't be confirmed until decades after the war, when classified files were finally opened and survivors' testimonies compiled. He died believing he'd failed. But 1,113 people lived because Werner Hartenstein chose humanity over orders, mercy over expedience, and honor over survival. That should have made him a hero. Instead, it made him classified. May 8, 1945. Flensburg, Germany. Provisional German government. Admiral Karl Donitz sat in what had been Hitler's final headquarters, now serving as the seat of Germany's surrender government. Hitler was dead. The Reich had collapsed. And Donitz, the submarine commander, had somehow become the last Führer of Germany for exactly 1 week before the formal surrender. He was reviewing documents to be destroyed before Allied forces arrived. Among them was the file on the Laconia incident and the order that bore his name. His aide, Konteradmiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg, entered the room. "Admiral, the British are demanding we preserve all records for war crimes tribunals. They specifically mentioned U-boat operations." Donitz looked at the Laconia file. Everything was there. Hartenstein's reports. Radio transcripts. Survivor testimonies from German crew members. Documentation of the American bombing. The complete truth of what had happened. "The Laconia order," von Friedeberg said quietly. "They'll use it against you at the trials. No attempt of any kind must be made to rescue. They'll call it a war crime, ignore the context entirely." "I know," Donitz said. "But we're not destroying this file." "Admiral." "No. We preserve everything. Let them see it all, the rescue attempt, the American bombing, why the order was issued. Let history judge with full knowledge, not Allied propaganda. They'll convict you anyway. Context won't matter to the victors." Donitz smiled grimly. "Probably. But the truth will be in the record. Someday, when emotions cool, when historians have access to all files from all sides, they'll see what really happened. They'll see that we tried mercy and were punished for it. That won't excuse other things we did. But it will complicate their simple narrative of good versus evil." The Laconia file was preserved. Handed over intact to Allied investigators. And almost immediately classified by the very people who demanded its preservation. November 20, 1945. Nuremberg, Germany. International Military Tribunal. The prosecution presented the Laconia order as Exhibit GB 199, reading it aloud in the cavernous courtroom. "No attempt of any kind must be made to rescue the crews of ships sunk, and this includes picking up persons in the water and putting them in lifeboats, righting capsized lifeboats, and handing over food and water. Rescue runs counter to the primary demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and their crews. The prosecutor, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, turned to face Dönitz in the defendant's dock. Admiral Dönitz, this order condemned thousands of Allied seamen to death. It violated the most basic principles of maritime law. It was an order to commit murder. How do you plead? Dönitz stood, his face carved from stone. He'd been a naval officer for 40 years. He'd commanded Germany's submarine force through 5 years of brutal warfare. He'd tried to fight with honor in a war that destroyed honor. The order, Dönitz said clearly, was issued after one of my submarine commanders attempted the largest rescue operation in submarine warfare history and was attacked by Allied aircraft while conducting that rescue. The context does not matter. Maxwell Fyfe interrupted. The order violates. The context, Dönitz continued, his voice rising, is that Kapitänleutnant Hartenstein spent 3 days rescuing Allied personnel, broadcasting his position in clear English, flying Red Cross flags, and was bombed by an American aircraft that killed approximately 100 of the survivors he was attempting to save. The Laconia order was issued to prevent my submarines from being destroyed while conducting rescue operations that the enemy would not honor. Silence fell over the courtroom. This was not in the script. Maxwell Fyfe recovered quickly. You're claiming the Allies bombed a rescue operation? That's a convenient fabrication. It's documented, Dönitz interrupted. Radio logs, survivor testimony, French naval reports, even Allied intelligence files which you have classified. Bring them forward. Let the court see everything. The judges conferred quietly. This was problematic. The Laconia incident was real, well documented, and deeply embarrassing to the Allied side. If they allowed full disclosure, it would undermine the narrative of the entire trial. The Chief Judge, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, made his ruling. The context of the order's issuance is noted but not relevant to its legal validity. The order itself violated international maritime law. That is what this tribunal must judge. It was a careful compromise. Acknowledge the context existed without examining it. Convict on the letter of the law while avoiding the spirit of what happened. Dönitz was convicted of war crimes related to submarine warfare. Sentenced to 10 years in Spandau prison. The Laconia order was cited as primary evidence of his criminality. But something unexpected happened during the sentencing phase. November 30th, 1945. Nuremberg. Judges' Chambers. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, had submitted a sworn affidavit to the tribunal. Its contents were explosive. I certify that unrestricted submarine warfare was carried out by the United States throughout the Pacific War, beginning from the first day. We did not rescue enemy survivors if doing so would compromise the safety of our submarines. We followed the same operational doctrine that Admiral Dönitz is accused of implementing. The American judge on the tribunal, Francis Biddle, read the affidavit with growing horror. Nimitz had just admitted that the United States did exactly what they were prosecuting Dönitz for doing. We can't ignore this, Biddle said to his fellow judges. If we convict Dönitz for ordering practices that we ourselves followed, then we acknowledge hypocrisy but maintain legal principle, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence replied. Dönitz is guilty of violating international law. That our own forces did the same is regrettable. But it doesn't change his guilt. It changes everything, Biddle argued. How can we convict a man for following the same doctrine we followed? How is that justice? It's Victor's justice, the Soviet judge, Iona Nikitchenko, said bluntly. We won. They lost. We judge. They hang. This has always been the nature of war crimes tribunals. In the end, a compromise was reached. Dönitz would be convicted, but his sentence would be reduced in recognition of the complex circumstances surrounding the submarine warfare charges. 10 years instead of life imprisonment or execution. The full details of the Laconia incident, the rescue operation, the American bombing, the context of the Laconia order were kept sealed in classified files. The truth was too complicated for public consumption. January 1946. Boston, Massachusetts. Doris Hawkins received a letter with a German postmark. It had been delayed for months by Allied censors, opened and read multiple times before being delivered. The handwriting was neat, precise, unmistakably German. Dear Nurse Hawkins, I am writing on behalf of my father, Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartenstein, who was killed in an air raid on March 6, 1944. Before his death, my father kept a private journal in which he wrote about the Laconia rescue operation. He mentioned you by name several times. He wrote, "The British nurse understood what we tried to do. She thanked me even as we were forced to abandon her. In another world, another time, she would have been a comrade worth serving with." My father carried guilt about the Laconia until his death. He believed he had failed because he could not save everyone. I write to tell you that the survivors did not see failure. My father received letters from 47 Laconia survivors over the months following the incident, before his death. Italians, British, even Polish survivors wrote to thank him. Some were intercepted by German censors. Others reached him. They told him he was a hero. He never believed them. I am told you have refused to give propaganda speeches about the incident. Thank you for this. The truth is too complicated for propaganda. War makes monsters of good men and heroes of reluctant men. My father was both. If you remember him, remember that he tried. In a war that demanded cruelty, he chose mercy. It cost him everything. Respectfully, Hilda Hartenstein. Doris folded the letter carefully and placed it in her Bible, where it would remain for the rest of her life. She never showed it to anyone. Never spoke about it publicly. But on March 6 every year, until her death in 1982, she would light a candle in her window. A private memorial for a German submarine commander who had saved her life and paid for that mercy with his own. October 1952. Rome, Italy. Giuseppe Spadoni, now a successful businessman in post-war Italy, was invited to speak at a naval history conference. The topic was submarine warfare and maritime law. He accepted immediately. The audience expected a talk about Italian naval operations. Instead, Spadoni told them about the Laconia. He spoke for 90 minutes without notes, describing everything in vivid detail. The torpedo strike. The sinking. The German rescue. The singing in the darkness. The American bombing. The French rescue. The aftermath. I survived, Spadoni concluded, because a German submarine commander valued human life over military advantage. I watched him risk his boat, his crew, his career to save enemies. And I watched him be punished for it. He paused, looking out at the audience of naval officers, historians, and journalists. The Laconia incident is still classified by multiple governments. They don't want you to know the full truth because it complicates their narratives. The Germans want you to forget they torpedoed a ship with 1,800 prisoners. The British want you to forget they put those prisoners on an unmarked military transport. The Americans want you to forget they bombed a rescue operation. But I won't forget. Neither will the other 1,112 survivors. We carry the truth. And we will tell it until history listens. The speech was covered by 3 Italian newspapers and 1 French journal. Within weeks, both British and American governments lodged official protests with the Italian Foreign Ministry, calling Spadoni's speech inflammatory and based on wartime trauma rather than facts. The Italian government issued a formal apology for allowing unverified claims to be made at a public conference. But Spadoni had accomplished his goal. The story was out. Not complete, not verified, but out there in the public record where it couldn't be completely buried anymore. May 1959. London. British Public Records Office. A young historian named Geoffrey Jones was researching submarine warfare when he stumbled across a reference to Laconia incident, file sealed under 50-year rule. 50 years. That meant the file would be opened in 1992. Jones filed a formal request to access the files early, citing historical research purposes. The request was denied. He appealed. Denied again. He wrote to his Member of Parliament. The MP received a letter from the Admiralty stating that certain wartime incidents remain sensitive for diplomatic reasons. Jones spent the next 15 years filing requests, appeals, and freedom of information petitions. Every single one was denied. In 1974, he received an anonymous package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph, obviously taken from an aircraft, showing a submarine on the surface with Red Cross flags clearly visible and dozens of people on deck. On the back, written in neat handwriting, September 14, 1942. U-156 conducting rescue operations. Bombed 30 minutes after this photo. 100+ casualties. Someone should tell the truth. Jones published the photograph in a naval history journal with a detailed article about what he'd pieced together from survivor testimonies, declassified German records, and educated guesses. The article was titled "The Incident They Don't Want You to Know." The British government immediately classified the photograph as official secrets and threatened prosecution if Jones published more. The journal withdrew the article from circulation. Only 200 copies had been distributed before the suppression. But 200 copies were enough. Other historians began investigating. Survivors who had remained silent for decades started coming forward. The truth was emerging, slowly, despite government efforts to contain it. September 12, 1982. Exactly 40 years after the incident. Doris Hawkins died peacefully in her sleep in Boston. Her obituary mentioned she had served as a nurse during the war and survived the sinking of RMS Laconia. Nothing more. In her will, she left a sealed envelope to be opened by her niece. Inside was a letter. "Dear Sarah, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. There's something I never told anyone, something I promised myself I'd leave in writing before I died. On September 12, 1942, I was torpedoed by a German submarine. The ship sank. Hundreds died. I should have died too. But the German commander surfaced and spent 3 days saving us. He risked his boat, his crew, his life. He treated us with dignity and kindness. He was a better man than most I've known. Then an American bomber attacked us. Killed dozens of survivors. Forced the Germans to leave us. I was in the water twice, once when the ship sank, once when the bomber attacked. The Germans saved me both times. Our own forces attacked me. I never told this story publicly because they threatened me. Told me it was classified, that speaking about it violated national security. For 40 years, I kept silent. But the truth matters more than national security. That German commander deserves to be remembered as a hero. The 1,113 of us who survived deserve to have our real story told. And the 100 who died in the bombing deserve to be recognized as victims of our own forces. His name was Werner Hartenstein. Remember it. Tell others. Don't let the truth die with my generation. With love, Aunt Doris. Sarah Hawkins spent the next 5 years researching her aunt's story. In 1987, she published a book titled The Laconia's Secret, The Rescue Germany Tried to Hide and America Tried to Forget. The book sold modestly but reached a critical audience, survivors, their families, and military historians who had been investigating the incident for decades. The silence was finally breaking. October 16, 1992. London. British Public Records Office. The 50-year seal expired at midnight. At 9 a.m., when the Public Records Office opened, 17 historians were waiting at the door, formal requests already filed, ready to access the Laconia files. What they found was both more and less than they expected. The files were comprehensive, over 3,000 pages of documents, photographs, radio transcripts, survivor testimonies, and official correspondence. But crucial sections had been removed. Pages were missing. Some documents were so heavily redacted that only the dates remained visible. Dr. Robert Watson, a naval historian from Cambridge, was among the first to review the unsealed material. What remained was still damning. Official British Admiralty memorandum from September 1942 acknowledging that Laconia carried Italian POWs without proper Red Cross notification. Radio transcripts of Hartenstein's broadcasts in clear English requesting assistance. Photographs taken from Vichy French rescue ships showing the aftermath. Internal U.S. Navy report confirming the bombing of rescue operations. Testimony from 127 survivors describing German rescue efforts. But the most revealing document was one that had been accidentally left unredacted, a memo from Winston Churchill himself, dated September 20, 1942. The Laconia incident must not become public knowledge. The Germans attempted a rescue operation that puts our own conduct in poor light. The subsequent American action, while militarily defensible, is indefensible in the court of public opinion. All witnesses must be instructed that discussing this matter constitutes breach of Official Secrets Act. Any journalist pursuing this story is to be discouraged by any means necessary. This war is about moral clarity. The Laconia muddles that clarity. Bury it. Churchill had ordered the cover-up personally. Dr. Watson published his findings in the Journal of Military History. The article, titled Laconia, The Rescue That Shamed the Allies, created international controversy. Within weeks, survivors and their families came forward with documents that had been hidden for 50 years. Letters, diaries, photographs, testimonies that had been suppressed for half a century. The truth, finally, was emerging into the light. November 1992. Washington, D.C. National Archives. The American response to the British declassification was to accelerate their own. Rather than allow the narrative to be controlled by partial British disclosures, the U.S. Navy opened its Laconia files as well. The American files were more complete than the British ones, and they contained the document everyone had been searching for, Lieutenant James D. Harden's complete after-action report. Harden had died in 1987, never having spoken publicly about September 14, 1942. But his report, written just hours after the bombing, was brutally honest. At 1,120 hours, I observed 3 submarines on the surface at coordinates provided. As briefed, submarines are priority targets regardless of circumstances. However, the circumstances were unusual. All 3 submarines were flying Red Cross flags. Multiple lifeboats were in tow. I observed through binoculars approximately 200 to 300 persons on the decks of the submarines, many appearing to be women based on dress. Additional lifeboats in the area were packed with survivors. I radioed base for instructions, describing the situation. Base command responded, attack. Submarines are legitimate military targets. Red Cross flags do not provide immunity to combatant vessels. I questioned this order, stating that attacking would likely result in high civilian casualties. Base command repeated, attack immediately. That is a direct order. I complied. Dropped 6 500-pound bombs. Scored 1 direct hit on a lifeboat, 2 near misses on submarines. Observed submarines diving, releasing lifeboats. Estimated casualties from bombing, 40 to 60 immediate, possibly more from drowning after submarines dove. Personal note, request to be relieved from future combat operations. Cannot in good conscience conduct similar missions. The people I killed today were being rescued. They were not combatants. This action violated every principle I was trained to uphold. Lieutenant James D. Harden, 343rd Bombardment Squadron. The report had been stamped classified, do not file in standard records, and buried in a safe where it remained for 50 years. Attached to Harden's report was a memo from his commanding officer recommending him for the Air Medal for aggressive action against enemy submarines, and another memo recommending his transfer to non-combat duties, due to unsuitability for operational flying. Both recommendations had been approved. Harden had been decorated for an action he considered a war crime, then quietly removed from combat because his conscience made him unsuitable for further killing. When the files were released, Harden's 3 children released a statement through their attorney. Our father carried the burden of September 14, 1942, for his entire life. He followed orders he believed were wrong and was decorated for it. He never forgave himself. We hope this disclosure helps the survivors and their families understand that he was not a monster, but a man forced to make an impossible choice. He chose obedience over conscience and paid for that choice every day until his death. The statement was accompanied by a copy of Harden's personal diary, kept secret from the military. September 14, 1942. Bombed German submarines today. They were rescuing people. I killed women and children in lifeboats. They gave me a medal. God forgive me because I cannot forgive myself. The entry repeated, with minor variations, on September 14th every year until 1987. December 1992. Rome. International Maritime Law Conference. The Laconia incident became the centerpiece of a major conference on maritime law and the conduct of submarine warfare. Survivors, now in their 70s and 80s, attended from around the world. Giuseppe Spadoni, now 72, gave the keynote address. He was one of only 27 known surviving Italian prisoners from the original 1809. For 50 years, Spadoni began, his voice still strong. Governments told us our story was classified. That revealing what happened would endanger national security. They told us the truth was too complicated for the public. They were right about one thing. The truth is complicated. War is complicated. Heroes and villains aren't as clear as propaganda claims. He paused, looking out at the audience of 400 people: historians, naval officers, survivors, families. Werner Hartenstein torpedoed a ship carrying 1,809 of my countrymen. By any standard, that makes him responsible for their deaths. But he spent 3 days trying to undo that mistake. He risked his life, his crew, his career to save enemies. He succeeded in rescuing more than 1,100 people. James Harden bombed a rescue operation, killing approximately 100 survivors and forcing the submarines to abandon hundreds more. By any standard, that makes him responsible for their deaths. But he was following orders. Orders he questioned. Orders he never forgave himself for following. The British Admiralty put prisoners of war on a military transport without proper notification or protection. By any standard, that makes them responsible for creating the conditions that led to 1,650 deaths. Spadoni's voice hardened. Everyone involved made mistakes. Everyone involved has blood on their hands. But only one group tried to save lives at risk to themselves. Only one group acted with honor in an impossible situation. And that group was commanded by a German submarine captain that the Allies wanted us to forget. I will not forget. None of us will forget. Werner Hartenstein was a hero. James Harden was a victim of impossible orders. The British Admiralty was criminally negligent. The truth contains all of this, not simple narratives about good and evil. The audience erupted in applause. Half was standing. Several British naval officers and attendants walked out in protest. But the ovation continued for 7 minutes. The truth, complex and uncomfortable, had finally been told in full. September 12, 2002. 60-year anniversary. Atlantic Ocean. A memorial service was held at sea, as close to the coordinates of the sinking as could be determined. Ships from 6 nations: Germany, Britain, the United States, France, Italy, and Poland participated in the ceremony. Only 4 confirmed Laconia survivors were still alive. 2 attended the ceremony. Molly Donovan, formerly Molly Davidson, was one of the British civilian children rescued by Hartenstein. She had been 8 years old in 1942. Now she was 68, a retired schoolteacher from Liverpool. I remember him, she said in an interview on the deck of the British destroyer HMS Manchester. The German captain. He gave me chocolate. Real chocolate, from his own rations. He picked me up in his arms and carried me below decks because I was too frightened to climb down the ladder. I remember his face, tired, sad, but kind. My mother told me later that he saved our lives. She told me never to forget that the enemy could be human too. Marco Benedetti, 82, was one of the Italian soldiers. He attended the ceremony from the Italian frigate Maestrale. We were in the water for 3 days total, Benedetti said. First time when the ship sank. Rescued by Germans. Second time when the Americans bombed us. Rescued by Germans again. Third time when the Germans were forced to leave us. Finally rescued by French. I was in the water 3 times, and twice it was because of Allied action. The mathematics of that has defined my view of war for 60 years. The ceremony included the traditional wreath-laying 6 wreaths, one from each participating nation, dropped into the Atlantic at the coordinates of the sinking. Representatives from each nation spoke. The German admiral acknowledged Hartenstein's violation of military protocol. The British admiral acknowledged the failure to properly protect POWs. The American admiral in the most significant moment acknowledged that the bombing of the rescue operation represented a failure of judgment that resulted in unnecessary loss of life. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of war crimes. But it was, finally, an acknowledgement of what had happened. The Italian admiral had the final word: "We honor 1,650 dead. We honor 1,113 survivors. We honor Werner Hartenstein and his crew for choosing humanity over expediency. We honor James Harden for living with impossible guilt. We honor all who suffered in this incident. May their memory teach us that war transforms decent people into participants in horror, and that honor can exist even in the midst of catastrophe." As the reefs drifted on the Atlantic swells, a single German submarine surfaced nearby, a modern Type 212, vastly different from U-156, but still bearing the legacy of that service. The submarine's commander rendered honors, and the crews of all 6 ships saluted. It was the first time since World War II that German submarines and Allied warships had gathered together over the site of a U-boat action, not for combat, but for remembrance. September 12, 2012. 70-year anniversary. Final accounting. The last confirmed Laconia survivor, Antonio Ferrara, died in Milan at age 92. He'd been 17 years old when U-156 pulled him from the Atlantic. He'd lived long enough to see the truth finally told, the files opened, the story acknowledged. His obituary, printed in newspapers across Europe, contained his final testimony. "I survived because a German submarine commander valued human life over military victory. I spent 70 years telling that story. I hope I told it well enough that the next generation understands. War is not about heroes and villains. It's about humans making impossible choices and living with the consequences." With Ferrara's death, the last living witness was gone. All that remained was the historical record, finally complete after 70 years of classification, suppression, and denial. The final accounting, compiled by international maritime historians in 2012, told the complete story. RMS Laconia, final statistics. Total passengers and crew, 2,732. British military, 268. Polish military, guards 103. Italian POWs, 1,809. British civilians, 80. Crew, 463. Women, 97. Children, 17. Killed in torpedo attack, approximately 400 to 500 died during sinking, approximately 550 to 650 rescued by U-156, U-506, U-507, 1,111 killed in American bombing, 100 to 120 died awaiting rescue, 200 to 250 final survivors, 1,113. U-boat casualties, U-506, lost with 52 crew. U-156, survived. Hartenstein killed March 1944. U-507, survived. Sunk January 1943, unrelated action. Legal aftermath, Admiral Donitz, convicted at Nuremberg, served 10 years. Lieutenant Harden, never charged, decorated, transferred to non-combat duties. British Admiralty officials, never charged. No formal apology issued by any government until 2002. Cultural impact. The Laconia incident became a case study in maritime law, military ethics, and the complexity of moral judgment in wartime. It demonstrated that following orders does not absolve individuals of moral responsibility. Heroic actions can emerge from situations created by catastrophic mistakes. War crimes and heroic conduct can exist simultaneously in the same incident. Government suppression of uncomfortable truths serves political narratives over historical accuracy. Human decency can exist even in the midst of industrial-scale killing. Werner Hartenstein's name is now listed in German naval records as a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. But more significantly, a memorial in Lorient, France, the former U-boat base, names him as a submarine commander who chose honor over orders. The British National Archives maintain a permanent exhibit on the Laconia incident with Doris Hawkins' letter, photographs from the rescue, and survivor testimonies. The exhibit concludes with a quote from Churchill's original suppression order, displayed alongside his later private admission in 1953. Some truths are so complicated they threaten to undermine necessary simplicities. But history demands we preserve even uncomfortable truths. The U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis uses the Laconia incident as a case study in ethics courses, examining impossible choices, lawful but immoral orders, and the burden of command decisions. Epilogue: the question that remains. The files are open. The truth is told. The survivors are gone. But one question remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. What should Werner Hartenstein have done? If he doesn't surface, 1,650 people die in the water without any rescue attempt. If he surfaces and rescues them, he risks his boat and crew, which is exactly what happened. If he follows orders after being attacked, he abandons survivors to their fate, which he did, following the doctrine that became the Laconia Order. There was no good choice. Only degrees of tragedy. Military historians still debate the incident. Some argue Hartenstein should never have attempted rescue in hostile waters. Others argue the attempt was morally mandatory regardless of military risk. Still others argue the real crime was British negligence in transporting POWs without protection. Everyone agrees on one thing: the American bombing of the rescue operation represents one of the darkest moments of Allied conduct in World War II, militarily justifiable under strict submarine warfare doctrine, but morally indefensible given the circumstances. The Laconia incident stands as a reminder that war creates impossible situations where every choice leads to horror. It demonstrates that heroes and villains, honor and atrocity, can exist in the same moment, performed by the same people. Werner Hartenstein torpedoed a ship carrying 1,809 prisoners and 1,000 other souls. That makes him responsible for one of the war's greatest maritime disasters. Werner Hartenstein spent 3 days risking his life to undo that mistake and saved 1,111 people. Werner Hartenstein torpedoed a ship carrying 1,809 prisoners and 1,000 other souls. That makes him responsible for one of the war's greatest maritime disasters. Werner Hartenstein spent 3 days risking his life to undo that mistake and saved 1,111 people. That makes him one of the war's greatest rescuers. Both facts are true. Both must be remembered. The German submarine captain surfaced to finish off a convoy and realized he'd torpedoed a ship full of Italian POWs and Allied nurses. What happened next was the most heroic rescue operation in submarine warfare history and the most shameful attack on rescuers. The truth took 70 years to emerge fully. But it was worth the wait. Because some truths, no matter how complicated, matter more than convenient lies. E.N.D.